Good evening, my name is Gareth Morgan, and today I'll be talking about physically based shading at Disney, which was a 2012 SIGGRAPH paper by Brett Burley. There'll be time for Q&A after the talk, but my Twitter handle is up there if anyone has later questions. The reason I like this paper is it's a really good introduction to physically based shading generally, as well as a description of how Disney implemented their pioneering physically based shading pipeline and the reasons why they implemented it the way they did. I've done this talk at PapersWeLove in San Francisco and at the VFX Tech meetup in San Francisco. They're both really good meetups if you have to find yourself in San Francisco. Additionally, I have my own meetup in San Francisco, which if you're interested in 3D generally, it's worth checking out on 3D. So what is physically based shading? So at a high level, I think these two images kind of describe what physically based shading is. The one on the left is from the early Pixar movie Toy Story. If you look at the surfaces in this image, they look really flat and kind of plasticky, which of course is fine because they're meant to be toys. But if you could compare these surfaces with the surfaces on the right from the more recent Disney film Zootopia, if you look at the way the fur and the fabric look in this image, and the way that the light interacts with them, they're much more realistic. That basically is what physically based shading is. It's a way of simulating how light interacts with surfaces, which is much more closely matched to how real hair, fur, and fabric behave in the real world. So to step back a bit, what is shading? So in the context of this paper, shading is surface shading. So to explain what that means, a bit of 3D graphics theory. Basically, 3D graphics is about solving the rendering equation, which is, so I have some point in my scene, x prime, and I want to know how much light arrives at my eye at point x from my point x prime. To do this, we need to solve the rendering equation. And the rendering equation is actually a kind of huge integral, a recursive integral. So to know how much light is arriving at my eye point x from my point x prime, I need to know how much light is arriving at all the other points x prime prime in the scene, reflecting off my point x prime and ultimately arriving at my eye at point x. This is a really complicated recursive integral. I've actually spoken about this in my previous PapersWeLove talk, which is online if you want to check it out, on the rendering equation. But what's important here is that for each of these points, we know some light travelling from this point x prime prime, hitting point x prime, only a small percentage of that light actually arrives at my eye at point x. Not all of it arrives there. And basically the point of a surface shader is to say, okay, I have my point x prime, I have my point x prime prime and my point x. What percentage of the light travelling from my point x prime prime, hitting point x prime, will arrive at my eye at point x? That's what a surface shader does. If your background is real-time graphics, the term surface shader can be a little confusing because shaders existed a long time before they were implemented in real-time graphics on chips. And surface shader doesn't exist on a GPU. It's not part of the graphics pipeline that's implemented on a GPU. Although it's still implemented in a real-time shading pipeline, it just tends to be a function in your fragment shader, not a specific part of the chip. So don't try and find a surface shader in your OpenGL or DirectX API. So when you have a surface shader, what you're actually doing is you're attempting to implement a function called a BRDF, that is a bidirectional reflection distribution function. This is a function that says, okay, I have my light vector traveling from my point x prime prime to my point x prime, and I have my view vector traveling from my point x prime to my point x. What percentage of the light traveling along my light vector will arrive at my eye along the view vector? To solve this equation, we need a bit more information. The first thing we need is a normal vector. A normal vector is a really important concept in 3D graphics. If you've ever touched 3D graphics at all, you've probably encountered a normal vector. It is a three-dimensional normalized vector that is exactly perpendicular to the surface at the point x prime. Again, it's a super important concept. If you've done anything at all in 3D graphics, you'll need to know about normal vector. Secondly, for convenience, we also have what's called a half vector. This is simply the vector that is exactly at the midpoint between the view vector and the light vector. So with these vectors, we can actually come up with a set of angles, which are the actual input to our BRDF. These are the parameters which our BRDF function takes. First, there is theta L, which is the angle between the normal vector and the light. Then there is theta V, which is the angle between the normal vector and the view vector. Then there's theta H, which is the angle between the normal vector and the half vector. And theta D, which is the angle between the half vector and the light vector. And because the half vector is halfway between the light vector and the v vector, that's also the angle between the v vector and the half vector. And then finally there's phi. This is a two-dimensional diagram, but if you imagine rotating the whole thing around the half vector into 3 dimensions, that is the phi angle that is the final parameter to the BRDF. Now, turns out humans aren't very good at visualizing 5-dimensional functions. Fortunately, actually included with the paper, Disney Animation Studios actually produced a bit of software which helps you visualize these functions. It's called the BRDF Explorer. It's freely available. You can download it from their website. And that basically is it's a bit of software that will visualize for you these BRDF functions. So the bottom half there, you see an object that's actually shaded with this BRDF. And then the top half, you see a CD pot of the BRDF itself. So here's an example of that. So the lines that you see coming out there are those vectors that we just talked about. So the light blue line on the left is your incoming light vector. The dark view line, labelled with N, is a normal vector that's directly perpendicular to the surface at that point. And then the pink lines actually are a reflection vector, which is what you get if you take the incoming light vector and reflect it around the normal. You get your reflection vector. And then the funny red blob is the BRDF itself. So that shape represents, for all the possible I directions, for all the possible V vectors, what is the value of the BRDF in that direction. And so the shape of that lobe is that plotted visually in 3 dimensions. So in this example here, we see we have these 2 lobes. So one is this kind of squished red lobe along the reflection vector. So what's that saying is basically, the BRDF is 0 everywhere, for every view direction, except for these 2 lobes, the BRDF is 0. So there's one region, one centered around the reflection vector, and one kind of squashed along the surface itself. We have some non-zero values. All the other values are 0. And so here, as a human, you can kind of say, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. Even though it's a 5-dimensional function and it's kind of complicated, it has some meaning to you as opposed to just a bunch of relevant symbols. And I'll be using diagrams from BRDF Explorer throughout the rest of this talk. So BRDFs have been around for a long time, from the earliest days of 3D graphics. But for most of that time, they weren't very complicated. Simple computation restrictions meant you couldn't have a very complicated BRDF, so people came up with some really basic approximations. So the one on the left is probably the simplest BRDF of all. It's the Lambert BRDF, named for the 16th century Dutch physicist. And it simply says that regardless of the view direction and the light direction, the outgoing value, the outgoing light is constant. So it doesn't vary with either the light or the view direction, it's just a constant value. So when you plot that in BRDF Explorer, it's just a hemisphere, which doesn't vary one way or another. I know, well, it's really simple. It actually does an okay job of simulating very diffuse surfaces like the painted surface of this room, the grey on these walls. That can be simulated fairly well with the Lambert shader. On the right, there's the other very commonly used BRDF, which is the Blin-Phong BRDF, named for Jim Blin and Wei Fong, 2 early graphics researchers. And it says that actually the BRDF is 0 everywhere, except for this blue node centered exactly on the reflection vector. And the size of that node is it's very simple done. It's just a dot product and a power function, and the size of the power function gives you whether you have a very tight node or a very wide node. It's very simple to calculate, and it does a again, pretty good job of simulating very simple, very smooth, shiny surfaces, which are very specular. The Blinfong does a pretty decent job of simulating them. And for most of the history of 3D graphics, basically these two BRDFs were all you had pretty much in many renderers. So a couple of digressions before I dive into the actual physically shading details itself, physically based shading details itself. First is a note on colour. So in the real world, colour is actually really complicated. The light actually around the world is made up of a whole bunch of different wavelengths of light, and when that light reaches our eye, those different wavelengths, or some of them, are interpreted as colour by our brain. And then as those wavelengths are bouncing around the world, they are absorbed and reflected differently based on the properties of the surfaces they're hitting. That's really complicated. So almost universally in 3D graphics, colour is just represented by three scalar values. So you have a 3D vector of red, green and blue. And in terms of a BRDF, in theory you have a different BRDF for both the red, green and blue. In practice, it's actually even simpler than that. The actual BRDF function itself tends to be the same for the red, green and blue, but the parameters, the constant parameters that define the surface at the BRDF and are the constant that are used to define the behavior of the BRDF, those, or many of them, are, rather than being scalar values, actually RGB three-dimensional vectors. So that's basically what I'm going to say in the matter. Just bear in mind that the rest of this talk, when I'm talking about a value, many of those values are actually three-dimensional. They're not just scalar values, they're three-dimensional RGB vectors. The other point I'd like to make is I'd like to describe what a BRDF and what physically based shading is not. Particularly in the real-time world, physically based shading is often associated with some kind of global illumination solution or a reflection probe system that takes into account all the light coming from different sources in the scene. That's not actually anything to do with the BRDF or physically based shading. The BRDF is simply a function that says, for this light direction, what percentage is going to be reflected in this view direction. Where that light comes from is beyond the scope of BRDFs and physically based shading. So it could be a simple, traditional, omnidirectional point light. It could be, if you're in a path tracer, it could be a ray trace calculation that colour is coming from. It could be a sample from a cube map, or it could be one of those complicated reflection probe system or spherical harmonic systems. It really doesn't matter. It's just a colour value. It's going to be, it's going to come back with a percentage. Okay, so with those caveats out of the way, let's jump into actual what physically based shading is. So over time, as computers became more powerful, people came up with a whole bunch of more complicated shaders, surface shaders that represented different types of materials. And some of them definitely were pretty complicated and did a pretty good job of simulating the behavior of certain materials. But they tended to be fairly arbitrary and not necessarily based on any physical reality in particular, and the parameters that were used as an input, the constant parameters that were used as inputs to those shaders, tended to be particularly arbitrary and had no actual physical meaning and had arbitrary value ranges that were valid. So a lot of people started thinking, well, we have all these arbitrary shaders, maybe we should do something more physically based. We should actually look at real-world materials and come up with a way of simulating, a more general way of simulating physically based materials rather than these just arbitrary shaders people are coming up with. And this is exactly what Disney did and what Brent described in his paper. And how they actually started the process was actually they looked at real world materials. So a BRDF is not a function that exists on a computer, it's a real world property that all materials in the real world have. And it turns out that the Mitsubishi Electric Company had compiled a database of real world materials and their BRDFs. They took some materials, they stuck them to a cylinder, and then they rotated the cylinder and they rotated the light and took lots of pictures of them and actually measured the actual BRDFs of these materials. And the result of this were these cubes of data. So for each slice in the cube, the x direction was our theta h value, that is the angle between the half vector and the normal. and the y direction represented the theta d value, the direction between either the light vector or the view vector and the half vector. And then for each slice, the z direction within the cube represented that phi value, so the rotation, the azeotropic rotation around the half vector. And these are some slices from real world materials in the MERL database. So Disney looked at these and said, okay, how do we come up with a BRDF that actually simulates how these materials actually behave in the real world? What they came up with, as described in the paper, was their principled BRDF system. So this is a system, a way of representing material that is physically plausible. It is actually based on how real-world materials behave in the real world, but it's also architectural. That is, real-world materials aren't really tunable. They're either metal or wood. You can't really tune them. That's not really, if you're an animated studio, that's not really any good. You want to be able to tune the look of your scene based on your art director's opinions. So the way they did this, they came up with this a huge set of parameters which they used to tune their principal BRDF system. And here is a list of them. Here, I'm not going to talk about all of them. And it's not, you can actually implement the Disney's physically based shading system without having all these parameters. So for example, Unity, the Unity shading system is also based on the Disney physically based shading system. It doesn't have anywhere near this number of parameters. So the first parameter that's actually not mentioned here is just the main color. So almost universally, all shaders have, all shading systems have what's called a main color, or diffuse color, or an albedo color, which is the diffuse color of the object, and it's what most people think of as the color of the object, quote unquote. Although in physically based shading, although it gets a little bit complicated because a red object its albedo color, or its diffuse color, or main color, might not actually be the same shade of red as you would think that object is. Once it's gone through the physically based shading system, that red color might actually get changed to something that's red, but not quite the same shade of red, which makes it a bit more complicated. But basically, your main color is the color of the surface. On top of that, you have values like the metallic parameter. So a key point about all these parameters is the plausible range of these parameters is always between 0 and 1. As I mentioned, prior to physically based shading, the parameters had completely arbitrary ranges. So you might have some that were 0 to 1, some that could be like 0 to tens of thousands. So trying to blend between materials was near enough impossible. So being 0 to 1 makes it much easier for the artist. So the metallic simply says between 0 and 1 it blends between a metallic material and a non-metallic material. There's also a roughness parameter. This is a very important concept in physically based shading. So it says, prior to physically based shading, where graphics is very good at doing very, very shiny objects and also very, very diffuse, rough objects, but not so much in between. Whereas in a physically based shading system, you have a slider that goes from one end of the scale, like a cue ball, a perfect specular reflective object, and at the other end of the scale, a painted, diffuse object that's completely that has no specular at all. And in real world, almost all materials actually are somewhere in the middle ground there. They're not cue balls or painted spheres. They're somewhere in the middle. There's also an anisotropic parameter. So when I first drew the BRDF function, you notice there was that phi parameter that basically rotated the whole thing around the half vector. This basically how you add. If your object ignores that, if your shader ignores that, then it is anisotropic. Is that right? It is anisotropic. Apologies for getting all my right. I always forget this. It is anisotropic in that it doesn't change as you rotate around the object around the half vector. If on the other hand this value is 1, it means it's isotropic. It's a very isotropic material. So we have that little right. It's anisotropic if it doesn't change. If it changes, it's isotropic if it doesn't change. I always get that confused. And so when the value is 1, you get these like very smeared specular highlights along a particular direction, in a kind of 3D direction along a particular phi value, anisotropy. And then finally, there are the clear coat values. So again, when they studied these materials, they noticed that it isn't as simple as just a single surface. Most materials actually have at least typically two surfaces involved. Like there is some of the light travels through the first surface, and there's another surface just underneath that then catches that light that travels through the first surface. The reason it's called clear coat, it actually comes from car paint. It was originally developed for specialist car paint shaders, where that effect is really obvious. And so basically, in the principle of BRDF, they just have a whole other pair of parameters that define that surface beneath the primary surface. So these are the parameters that they gave to their artists to define what they call their principle of BRDF. So what is the principle of BRDF? Well, the principle of BRDF is based on what's called the microfacet model. So this is the idea that you can actually very accurately simulate the behavior of light's interaction with a surface by simulating that surface as a whole bunch of really tiny facets. And each one of those facets is a perfect mirror. That is another really simple BRDF, a perfect mirror that says if you're looking directly along the reflection vector, then BRDF is 1. It's 0 everywhere else. So all your surface is made up of a huge number of these microfacets. So it's actually analogous to, if you're familiar with physics and thermodynamics, it's analogous to the same way that thermodynamics defines the behavior of a gas as pressure and temperature changes. It doesn't try and simulate the behavior of each individual molecule of the gas. It uses statistical methods to work out the behavior, the statistical average behavior of those molecules in order to define how gases behave when they're heated and cooled. This is basically the same analogy, but we're talking about how light interacts with the surface, not how gas interacts with the objects around it. So basically, you can take this microfacet model of how surfaces behave when they interact with light, and use statistical methods to come up with some equations that define, to basically define your BRDF. Disney did this, and this is what they came up with. This is the Disney BRDF in all its glory. I'm going to dig into it in a second. The key points to notice is there is a diffuse term on the left, and now traditionally, prior to physically-based shading, the diffuse component of the BRDF was basically considered Lambertian, that is, a constant. It didn't actually change with the view direction. It turns out this is a poor approximation, and I'll get a reason for that in a second. And then on the right, you have the specular term, and that's divided into these three functions, D, F, and G. These are basically the functions that make up a physically-based shading system. And again, I'll get to those shortly. Okay, so again, in the traditional shading system prior to PBS, diffuse was just a color. It wasn't a function. It was assumed to be constant. But when you look at real-world materials in the Merle database, that's actually not a good assumption at all. So here are some. So if you look at the behavior of the BRDFs in these in the database, in the center of the slice, where you don't have any grazing angles, it's actually pretty constant and could be simulated with just a constant color. But the moment you end up with these grazing angles, that goes out of it. If you look at the white border on these squares, that's saying that it's no longer our here. Traditionally, you would simulate this just as a constant red color, but if you look at around the edges of these slices, it's clearly not a constant red color. It's like it goes to white in the top left, or bright red in the bottom right. The Disney, the mathematicians at Disney took it, actually came up with an equation that represented what they saw in the Merle database, and this is what they came up with. They're not personally, you make a profession, not actually mathematicians, so I don't actually know how they came up with this, but on the bottom here you see the results. So this is not an entry in the Merle database. This is the results of this equation, and you can see it if you compare it to the previous slide where there were actually values from the Merle database. You can see it matches it pretty well. This is the diffuse term of the principal BRDF. So next we have the D term, that is the distribution function. So again, yeah, we're looking at a statistical method of analysing this BRDF, and for this term, what's important is whether all those tiny microfacets that make up our surface, what direction is the normal of those microfacets. On the right, you have one that's actually perfectly smooth. All the normals are pointing along all the normals of the microfacets, so what's called the microfacet normals are pointing along the macrofacet normal. I think that is the normal that I talked about before. And if the microfacets are all aligned with that, you have a perfectly smooth specular surface. That would be the kind of thing that a Bling foam shader could represent. On the left here, you see the opposite side of that, where you see all the normals are actually completely randomly distributed. There's nothing special about the macro facet normal at all. They're just likely to. They're no more likely to be pointing along the macro facet normal as they are in any other direction. And as I said, most materials aren't either of these extremes. They're somewhere in the middle here, like this one in the middle, where they tend to be pointing along the normal, the macro facet normal, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are offset by some amount. And so again, you can use, just as in thermodynamics, you can use physical, you can use statistical methods to analyze this and come up with a function that represents the behavior of light on average, what will light do when it hits its surface, and what they came up with is what the Disney people decided to choose, which was the what's called the generalized Trombridge-Wright method, if I'm remembering it correctly, which is a statistical method of coming up with an equation that represents the behavior of light when it hits the surface. And the key point here, it has this alpha value which represents the roughness of the surface. So if the roughness is 1, it's all the way on the left there. If the roughness is 0, it's all the way on the right. Like most materials have roughness between those two values. Here's that plotted on using the BRDF Explorer. So a fairly smooth surface. You get a very well-defined specular highlight, and you have quite a narrow blob in your BRDF. When you have a more rough surface, your highlight becomes much less well-defined, and your blob becomes wider and less narrow. So the next term is the S term, the Fresnel term. Again, named after a long-dead physicist in this time Augustin Jean Fresnel from the French from the 18th century. And he studied what happens when light enters a transparent object. So when it enters the medium from the air or from some other medium. And the key point he came up with here is that so if you look at this curved window, you look at when the light is hitting the window straight on, it tends to go through the window. And in fact, you can see the furniture in this apartment. On the other hand, when the light is hitting at a more grazing angle, it tends to be reflected, so you see what's on the outside of the window, and you can't see what's inside, so you can see the sky. So this, when you look at this in terms of BRDF, this is what you see. So you have some incoming light. If there's a grazing angle, the majority of the light is reflected and reaches the eye, and only a small amount of light is refracted and enters the surface. As the surface becomes less grazing and moves towards the half vector, the less is reflected and more is refracted, until when you have a fairly steep angle, the majority of the light enters the surface and is refracted, and only a small amount is reflected and reaches the eye. This is the Fresnel term of the physically based shading model. This is for this, Disney chose to use what's called the Schlick approximation, based on someone called Schlick who came up with it in a recent paper. And so here you can see why this is a good approximation. So on the left, we see those what's called the Fresnel factor for given materials, either things like glass and adamantine and other things, and some other transparent materials. On the left, that's the actual measured Fresnel factor for those materials, and on the right is the Schlick approximation for that, which is this equation you see at the bottom there. This is just a good way of factoring in how much will the amount of reflected light drop off as the angle becomes more or less gradient. Basically, that's a Fresnel term of a physics-based shading model. And here we see again that's plotted. So when you plot that in the BRF Explorer, you get this kind of squished blob along the reflection vector. And this is what you see when you plot the Saturn on an actual shaded object. And then finally, there is the G term. This is again another. We have to go back and look at statistical methods to solve this. So whereas the previous term we talked about was simply looked at the alignment of the normal vectors, this is looking at, well, not all the light at a particular point in our microfacets. Not all the light is actually going to reach the outside world. It's going to hit other microfacets and be occluded. And this is what I've kind of drawn here on the left. We see if you look at all the light, all the possible light directions coming from this point, some of them can reach the outside world, some of them can't. Some of them are occluded by neighbouring microfacets, and they don't reach the outside world. This is for the Disney principle of BRDF. The equation they decided to use was the GGX equation created by Walter in 2007, which is, again, even if people don't use the Disney BRDF, the GGX form of physically based shading is also really, really common. And this is the equation they came up with. So on the bottom we have the what's called the monodirectional form of the equation. That's just saying, just looking at one direction. The funny X on the left, whose name I forget, but not Phi, it's Chi possibly, simply says that's monodirectional. So all the points on which the macro and micro normal are diverge are more than 90 degrees apart. It's zero, so it's just looking at one direction. And then it's based on the theta v value between the view direction and the normal, and again our roughness value. And we actually have two of these. So we have two of these in order to form our BRDF. We have two of these monodirectional functions, one based on the view direction and one based on the light direction, and we take the product. That's what that top. This isn't actually in Brent's paper. It's from the original Walter's original GGX paper, which they took it from. And so basically, you have two of these monodirectional functions form the G term that is used in the BRDF. Again, here we see that plotted. You come up with this kind of strange mushroom type object when you see it plotted in the BRDF Explorer, and you see it again. You see that it gives a kind of diffuse, smooth, diffuse component to the BRDF, which is important again. Even on objects that you think of as shiny, they do still have this diffuse component to them. I'm talking to point. And a key point about the microfacet distribution model that they that they talk about in the paper is that I mentioned earlier the clear coat values. That in the real, that actually they discovered that, well, really most surfaces aren't just one surface; they're two surfaces. You have the first surface and then the clear coat surface. They actually have two terms with different gamma values. In the Disney BRDF, they have one representing the top surface and one representing the clear coat surface, with different gamma values and separate, different constant gamma values and then different roughness values for the two surfaces. And that's how they in Disney BRDF how they represent the more complicated two-layer surfaces. So yeah, so when you put all these terms together, you get a really good physical approximation of quite capable of running on even mobile GPUs nowadays. Can implement a form of this that is pretty accurate, and you can get really good physically correct surfaces just with these handful of equations. thank you. Any questions? And also, plug of my company, Active Graphics. We're making a 3D content creation tool which has a path tracer on the cloud for rendering photorealistic videos. We have an alpha starting in the next couple of weeks. If anyone wants to apply, it's on the website. Also, any investors.
So I guess the kind of really hard bit then is working out what that light vector is actually kind of pointing at.
Yes, that is, basically, you can, yes, that's why the ray tracing, in a path tracer, that's basically why you always have, you can get a more photorealistic result from a ray tracer than from a real-time rendering. There is no universal good way of working that out for, without ray tracing, without rasterized real-time ray tracing.
And it's that light vector that kind of accounts for reflections and things like that as well as just the surfaces.
So obviously the key point of the physics-based shading model is that the whole hemisphere matters, even in stuff you think like, oh, this, that like, oh, we don't really need. There's no reflection component on this paint, but actually, if you put it, when you look at that paint, the equivalent of that paint in the Merle database, there is actually a reflection component. It isn't just a constant color. So you do need to know the whole hemisphere of what's going on. The light from over there, the light that are bouncing off over here, and that isn't solved by physics-based shading. You need something on top of that to say where that's coming from.
So just to have an idea of the computational complexity, so you said that like a standard commodity GPUs can render something like that? What I don't understand is you're talking just about the still image, or if you want to animate, you have to multiply that.
A real-time shader, like there are those decent mobile phones now have implementations of these equations that run in a fragment shader, so it can do 60 frames a second real-time. It doesn't solve the problem we're talking about. He was talking about where that light coming from, but in terms of the actual BRDF, that's most new phones can do that now.
Is that kind of as far as BRDFs have got at the moment, or is there still more research pushing?
There's a lot of it looking at more, well, through these, the scattering, the BS, bidirectional scattering frontier, BSDFs, BDFs, whichever one it is. Look at the whole 360 rather than 180 degrees, and looking at more, basically more complicated solutions where you're talking, and of course, when you're talking about light coming from in the surface as well as outside the surface.
Nothing more?
All right.
Thank you again, Gareth. For those of you